Hello there, history nerds. I'm Mitzi, your host, and you're watching LNN News. Today, we're going to be giving you a rundown of the world's wars. Exciting, I know. First, we will be discussing what caused World War I. Lucy, Elena, take it away.
Hi there, folks. I'm Lucy, and this is Elena. We will be talking about what caused World War I.
Specifically nationalism entailing alliances, militarism, and imperialism.
Yes, so let's begin with nationalism. First off, what is nationalism? It's defined as identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. It is nationalism that birthed the idea of assassinating the Archduke Ferdinand, which many historians say is a direct result of why World War I began.
Next is alliances. As we all know, there were two major alliances in Europe at the start of World War I, the Allied powers and the Central powers. The Allied powers consisted of Britain, France, Russia, Portugal, Italy, Serbia, Greece, and Romania, while the Central powers consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So when the Archduke was killed by the Black Hand, Austria wanted them reprimanded. But Serbia backed the assassins and refused to hand them over. Austria-Hungary overreacted and declared war after consulting.
Then, since Russia and Serbia were allies, Russia joined the fight. And soon all of these countries were fighting a battle that really should have been between two, just because all the alliances pulled them in.
But what about militarism? Well, just before the war, everyone started investigating and building up their military. Russia, Great Britain, Germany, and the US are just some examples of people who largely build up their empire.
And imperialism. Imperialism played a large role because as big European countries imperialized, tension grew in and around Europe. So when the war began, everything was more hectic than originally intended.
Now that we have covered that, Mitzi, back to you at the station.
Thanks, girls. Now that we know what caused the war, let's head over to Hope, who has interviewed an actual soldier who was in the war. Let's see what he has to say. Hope?
Yes, hello. I'm here with Brandon Gainey, who was fighting in the war for the U.S. Tell us, Cullen, what were the war conditions like?
Yes, hi there, Hope. You can call me Cullen. It's what everyone calls me. It was hard, I'm not gonna lie. Since air travel wasn't invented yet, I had to travel on a ship to France, which was crowded and uncomfortable, and many of the men got seasick since they had never spent any time on the water. By the time we got there, the war had already been going on for several years. When we arrived, the front looked like the surface of the moon, with trenches and craters spread across the land.
The trenches were called the Western Front, correct?
Yes, they were. They were trenches around 400 miles long and were about 4 feet wide and 8 feet deep. Although in some places it was much different. Some of the trenches were dug in a zigzag pattern so that shell fragments wouldn't go too far.
Speaking of shell fragments, tell us about the new technological advances that were used in the war.
Yeah, so there were sections of the trenches that were called strong points, where we would put machine guns or guns that would fire multiple bullets quickly without having to do the extra manual work. These sections were made of concrete rather than just a hole in the ground. There were also tanks, which you know were large automobiles made for the terrain and to withstand ballistic fire. There were lots of new weapons such as poison gas that would be fired into the trenches.
Oh, wow. Seems like a very hard time for you and all the other soldiers that participated in the war, no matter what side you were on. If you don't mind, can I ask one more question?
No, not at all. Go for it.
What were some war tactics that countries used?
Okay, so there's one that I think is just wild. So this was the first used by Germany in 1914, and it's where soldiers would dig tunnels under our lines, under the battlefield, and then using explosives, they would then blow up the tunnels underneath, destroying anything and anyone who was over it. Some other tactics were the chemical and poisonous gases shot into each other's trenches and territories.
Wow, okay. Thank you so much for sharing what the war was like, Brandon, and thank you for your service.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.
Okay, Mitzi, back to you at the studio to send us our next topic.
Thank you, Hope. And again, thank you to Brandon for sharing with us. In our next segment, we're going to be talking about the end of the war and all that was involved after the war. Talking about this is our newest host, Addie. Addie, take it away.
Yes, let's begin with the Treaty of Versailles. This is the peace treaty that ended the war between Germany and the Allied powers, making it the most important treaty that the war produced. It was signed on June 28, 1919. The treaty stated that Germany had to surrender their territories, return the Alsace-Lorraine to France, make Danzig a free city, and pay for the war damage reparations, which was 132 billion gold marks or 33 billion USD, along with some other things. All I know is if I were Germany, I would be very angry. This also resulted in the Mandate, which replaced Ottoman control. Specifically, it was an authorization granted by the League of Nations to a member nation to govern a former German or Turkish colony. The territory was called a mandated territory or mandate. Well, that about covers it. Mitzi, back to you at the studio.
Thank you, Addie, for that rundown of the Treaty of Versailles. Next, we are heading on over to Jade to analyze the destabilization of Europe during the collapse of the great empires after the war.
After the war to end all wars was over, the world was not the same. Europe was dismantled and not much was the same on a global scale. Countries like Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany, and Russia lost territory. The west end of Russia split up into 4 countries now called Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Germany lost territory that was added to Poland. Bulgaria lost territory to Greece. There was also dynasties such as the Romanov family. The ruler of this dynasty, Tsar Nicholas, was not a good ruler. He ignored the terrible state of his country while he was away at war, and he ended up being executed with the rest of his family, while Russia was left to rebuild all aspects of their country, from things like economy to government to food supply. There was also an empire called the Habsburg Empire. The last ruler of this empire was Charles V, who was the ruler over Austria-Hungary. The next person in line was Archduke Ferdinand, but he was assassinated before he was able to take the throne, which you know from earlier today was one of the main causes of World War I. After their dynasty dying out, the country was left to maintain and rebuild themselves. All of these, along with many other instances, contributed to the destabilization and disbandment of Europe after the war. Mitzi, back to you. Peace up, A-Town.
Thanks, Jade. It's crazy that things can change that much in just a few years and how time and situations work out. In this next segment, we'll be discussing the Russian Revolution with 2 of my favorite hosts, Monica and Chloe. Ladies, to you.
Hello, I'm Monica.
And I'm Chloe, and today we'll be talking about the causes and results of the Russian Revolution, which marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and centuries of Russia's imperial rule.
And how it pertains to the rise of the Bolsheviks under the Lenin all the way to Stalin's 5-year plan.
Let's begin with some causes. The revolution began as a result of tensions between tradition and change, the Japanese War, the rise of Rasputin, and the World War I.
World War I contributed because it caused food shortages, government mismanagement, and uprisings in St. Petersburg. The revolution was actually made up of many revolutions, which first we will talk about the February Revolution, which in current calendars happened in March of 1917. People who were demanding bread were in the streets and were supported by large crowds of protesting industrial workers. They all fought with police and refused to leave. The protests ended up with the protesters overthrowing the monarch, ending Romanov rule.
Next, we will discuss the Bolshevik Revolution, better known as the October Revolution, which again in current times happened in November of 1917. Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, led the revolution against the government. Lenin called for the working class to rule that would become a Soviet government. The Bolsheviks took over government buildings and locations and pushed the people out, creating the government they wanted, allowing Lenin to become the first dictator of the communist state.
It also consisted of the Russian Civil War. In this war, there was the Red Army, who were fighting for the Bolsheviks, who was led by Lenin, and the White Army, who was fighting for the monarch and capitalism. The White Army was supported by Britain, France, the US, and Japan. The Red Army claimed victory, resulting in the creation of the Soviet Union.
Before we go, let's talk about some results of the Russian Revolution. The biggest result was Stalin's first 5-year plan.
Stalin introduced it in 1928. It consisted of development of iron and steel, machine tools, electric power, and transport. He also demanded major increases in production of things like coal production, iron production, and electric power. It did not work out like he planned, but that's a story for another day.
Mitzi, back to you at the studio.
Thank you, ladies. That was fascinating. Now, back to Monica and Chloe discussing a rise in fascism in Europe and Asia. Ladies, take it away.
Ooh la la. Hello there. Let's first begin with what fascism is. Fascism is defined as an authoritarian and nationalistic right-wing system of the government and social organization, or extreme authoritarian, oppressive, or intolerant views of practice. Now let's compare some fascists, shall we?
Let's begin with Benito Mussolini. He was appointed prime minister at the head of the three-member fascist cabinet, and he cooperated with the Italian parliament. But then, after being aided by his brutal police force, he soon became the dictator of Italy. Not too far after, a socialist backlash was suppressed, and after that, a fascist state was officially proclaimed, with Mussolini as the second Duce, or the leader. He created a society where all aspects of life were controlled by the government, called a totalitarian state. At first, he appealed to Italy's Western allies to create treaties with, but after he conquered Ethiopia in 1935, the chance was lost as they were democracies and this did not appeal to them.
Let's talk about the rise of Hitler. With Germany in a state of identity crisis in 1920, Hitler and his Nazis were able to step in to breach the situation. After the beer hall putsch, Hitler was charged with high treason, but this only brought him more fame and attention, and he was out by the end of the year. Hitler made speeches and campaigns about post-war plight in Germany, and he gave the society a scapegoat, the Jews and other things for people to put blame onto. This was apparent that Hitler was winning the public relations battle, and even though he was losing his case, he said that he would ignore the court's verdicts because the external court of history was on his side. He spent the remainder of the year in prison, during which the time a book came out that made him more popular than ever, allowing him to take over Germany one step at a time. Within 8 years, he became dictator of the country.
Last but not least, let's discuss Emperor Hirohito. He sought out to get more natural resources, and in 1931 he attacked Manchuria. The League of Nations condemned this, but later in 1937 he did it again in Nanjing. His attack lasted for 6 weeks and was nicknamed the Rape of Nanjing for its brutality and awfulness. There had also been a desired new order for East Asia, so he placed sanctions on oil and iron.
Well, that wraps up our little segment. Mitzi, back to you.
Thank you, guys. That was wonderful. Now, on to Lauren and Lucy to discuss totalitarianism.
Yes, hello. Let's begin. Totalitarianism is defined as a system of government that is centralized or dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state.
A police state is now a derogatory word that describes the undesirable state of living in a society overrun by the major presence of civil authorities. People live in a society where the government exercises power arbitrarily by using police force. Some examples of police states during this time period was Nazi Germany. It started as a democratic state and slowly excreted more control onto its people, leading up towards World War II.
It was also in the Soviet Union. They had extensive police and intelligence services, like the KGB. It had around 2.5% of the adult population serving as informants for the Stasi, the Ministry for State Security or State Security Service.
But how does this differ from authoritarian government? Authoritarian governments are systems that denote any political systems that concentrates power in the hands of a leader or small group that are not constitutionally responsible to the body of the people. The two forms are quite similar in that they both require blind and complete submission to the state.
Thanks for listening.
Mitzi, back to you.
Action. Now, that was truly fascinating, ladies. Thank you for telling us about that. Now to returning hostess Elena and Lucy to talk to us about aggression and conflicts. Ladies?
Action.
Yes, we will be discussing the aggression and conflict leading up to the World War II, directed in the areas of Europe and Asia.
Let's start with Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. It has a conflict between the armed forces of the Kingdom of Italy and the armed forces of the Ethiopian Empire. Italy defeated Ethiopia and annexed them and subjected them to military control. The Ethiopian Empire became part of the Italian colony, but fighting then continued until the Italians defeated in 1941.
Next, let's talk about the Spanish Civil War. It lasted from 1936 to 1939. The Republicans were loyal to the left-leaning Second Spanish Republic, who was called with the anarchists and communists, while the nationalists allianced with Phalangists, monarchs, and Catholics. The war was between a democracy or a fascism state of government. The nationalists won and ruled Spain until their leader Francisco Franco died in 1975.
Next, the rape of Nanjing in China. We briefly discussed this earlier in today's show. So briefly, the rape of Nanjing, or the Nanjing Massacre, was an episode of mass murder and mass rape by Japanese troops against the people of Nanjing, China.
Lastly, before we leave, let's talk about how Germany violated the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty said that Hitler was not allowed to rebuild the army. Yet in 1935, Hitler restarted the conscription process in Germany and built up the Navy and Air Force. He also stopped paying war reparations, which was under the treaty, as Germans needed to pay for the damages caused by the war. There are many other ways, but you get the point. Ha 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 ha.
See you later. Mitzi, to you.
Now to you.
Thanks, ladies, for all that information. It's crazy what people can do. Now on to Lauren to talk about the effects that World War I had after it was over.
Hey there, I'm here to discuss some effects of World War I on the world. The war caused the downfall of 4 major monarchies, which we discussed earlier. It marked the end of colonialism as people became more nationalistic. The war also greatly changed the economic balance of the world, leaving Europe with lots of debt, but also leaving the United States, the leading producer of industrial power. Inflation went through the roof, especially in Germany, since they had to pay for the civilian war damages. The war also changed the face of modern warfare because of all the new weapons and technologies that were created. The social life of societies also changed, especially regarding women. Many women began running businesses since most of the men were off fighting. Labor laws were also produced during this time because of the mass production and mechanization. In many ways, World War I is still very important today and affects the lives of everyone, even if you don't realize it. Mitzi, back to you.
Thanks, Lauren. I agree that World War I definitely changed the face of the world and still impacts the people of society today. But let's talk about World War II and how that affected society. Lauren?
Yes, hello again. So World War II also had some very major impacts. There was a major power shift from England and Germany to the United States and to the USSR, which also contributed to the spread of communism since the USSR began setting up satellite nations in Europe. Tensions also began to rise when the US and the Soviet Union, which led to the Cold War and the arms race. Because the US was able to become a power, their economy boosted, which significantly helped end the Great Depression. Winston Churchill of England also stated that there would now be an iron curtain across Europe, talking about how now the continent was divided between Eastern and Western Europe. Germany as a whole was also devastated due to the rule of Hitler and his Nazis, and what they had done to the Jews. The whole world was in shock once they learned of the awful wrongdoings of the Nazi Party. And not only that, but the economy of the nation was destroyed due to the massive spending of the Nazis to feed the war machine during its last final days. As you can see, there were many effects, and there's even more. Go to our YouTube channel to learn even more. Mitzi, back to you.
Yes, I definitely think everyone should go and take a look at our YouTube channel where we have extra clips from our segments and some news stories that no longer air that teach us a lot of valuable information. Thanks for learning with us today, and we hope to see you tomorrow to discuss some more history. See you next time on LNN News. This is Mitzi, and good night.